The Philippines is currently undergoing a dramatic transformation in its national security doctrine. What we're looking at is nothing less than comprehensive archipelagic defense of our huge coastlines, among the biggest on Earth. And aside from relying on traditional Western partners and Japan, the Philippines is also reaching out to other rising powers, including India, not to mention also making sure that we have robust relationship with like-minded countries within the region, especially within ASEAN, such as Vietnam. But more than that, the Philippines is also not out of the woods when it comes to domestic security issues. So is the Philippines moving on the right direction by increasingly focusing on external security? Is the situation back home, especially in the rest of Mindanao region, increasingly stable? What are the strategies by the Philippine government to ensure that we're strong at home and at the same time have an increasingly modern armed forces that can protect our national interests and territorial integrity externally for the decades to come? In order to better understand the big picture of the Philippine national security, a 360 degrees view at our national security concerns, and also positive developments and opportunities over the horizon, we have a special guest. Joining us tonight again is Usec Malaya from the National Security Council. Thank you very much for joining us again, Usec.
I have no choice.
Yeah. Well, you have no choice.
When you call, I have to answer.
Well, because para sa bayan, as
Para
they
sa
say.
bayan,
Para sa
yes,
bayan. But
yes, yes.
of course, in previous episode, we discussed the big picture, the grand strategy for the Philippines, us emerging as a middle power, working with other middle powers. Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky before we talk about domestic national security issues. If you look at a lot of, and I'm active on social media, a lot of statement of solidarity that tend to come out is Australia,
Yeah.
Europe, Japan, sometimes South Korea, sometimes India, United States. It looks like quite a limited slice of the international community, right? I mean, of course, a lot of these are flagship democracies, countries at the forefront of the rules-based international order preservation, especially the middle powers, right? Ibang usapan yung mga superpowers. We're going to have a long conversation about that. So some are wondering, shouldn't we see more from ASEAN, right? I've heard many criticism coming from the Philippines, not from officials, but people like me, people in the academe, people in the think tank world. Some of them would say ASEAN's usefulness is frankly questionable. Some would say it's actually worse. They are enabler. And to be honest, I've been in conferences all around the world whereby I would hear from other ASEAN guys saying, "No, the situation is stable. China is a great trading," and so they talk as if the Philippines doesn't exist. And then when I kind of nicely bring it up, they'll say, "Oh, well, that's an exceptional case." So they kind of try to pigeonhole us. To be honest, you mentioned in towards the end of our previous episode that at least what we can look towards cooperation when it comes to ASEAN is working bilateral and unilateral with some of them, right? So honestly, as Filipinos, we put it, ano ambag ng ASEAN sa atin in the midst of this conflict? I know you're not from DFA, and I know you don't want to preempt what the DFA is saying, but I want to understand the National Security Council, how you understand our approach to the rest of ASEAN should be.
Well, there's this long-standing code of conduct negotiations, which has been going on for so long.
Long standing. Just to be clear, yeah.
Yes, it's been going on for so long. So, but nonetheless, there's still hope there. So let's see where it brings us. But given the president's directive for a paradigm shift, we are now looking at bilateral arrangements with other countries, or what is called as minilaterals. No?
Right.
ASEAN, of course, is a difficult issue because we're all neighbors of China. Okay, so ASEAN countries have different levels of interest insofar as expressing their support for the Philippines is concerned. There are domestic issues at play.
Yes.
There are bilateral issues between China and these countries. And I don't want to go to that because
Yes.
it's a very complex and complicated arrangement. However, we're seeing that Vietnam has been very open about coming to some sort of arrangement with the Philippines. So we have this MOU between the Vietnamese Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard.
This is during the president's visit to Vietnam earlier this year, right?
That's right. And even before that, Richard, the Vietnamese Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard have good relations. We see each other at sea. There's mutual respect. There's good neighborly relations
We
between.
played volleyball.
They played-
Sure, yeah, exactly.
Stuff like that. So we really have no issues. So the president pursued that, and the Vietnamese government we're glad that they reciprocated. So we have this arrangement with Vietnam. We're also looking at Indonesia, and I think there's an opening there. I think the Indonesians understand where we're coming from, and I think the Indonesians realize that they have to stand up also for the Philippines, because the issues in the West Philippines does not impact the Philippines alone. It impacts the entire region and in fact the world. So let's see where that takes
Especially
us.
if it escalates, as we discussed in the previous episode. While there's hope that we can keep it below a certain threshold, there's always, a little chance for things to get out of control. I think the president made it very clear, both in Australia during the Australia-ASEAN summit and more recently in one of his international interviews, that his worry is that there will not be a strategic decision for conflict, that small skirmishes could spiral into something more dangerous. So I think we have no less than President Marcos Jr. recognizing that there's always a potential spark that
Yes.
that could, and I'm sure the other ASEAN countries are looking at it along those lines.
Yeah, but you'd be surprised, outwardly they may not express support for the Philippines, but
Right.
when you talk to them informally and individually, they'll tell us really what's on their mind. So it's just that they can't at this moment
Articulate it openly.
articulate it online or articulate it publicly because of domestic issues, because of they also have their own interests to
Yeah.
protect.
And
But
dependence on China
but
economically. Yeah.
yes, but you talk to them individually when we have informal dinners with them, they do express some support for the Philippines.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think one of the European experts recently told me when I was in Berlin that sometimes there's like China summits with other countries, and then they're like sub summits like with ASEAN, and usually those meetings tend to get longer and more tense from what they hear. It's like, okay, once the Europeans and Westerners are out, suddenly they get honest with each other. Like, what are you doing this? I thought you're a good big brother, and but having said that, my problem is that you have, I think people can guess who's this person, a neighboring prime minister, a
Okay.
neighboring country prime minister, openly coming out and warning against not what China is doing against the Philippines, warning against China phobia. His worry is that we're too demonizing China. His worry is that we're not appreciating China's positive contribution. And some would say that doesn't sound like them just trying to be polite. Some would say that sounds like some people lawyering for China, right?
Yeah.
Something that some would say we used to do under different president. But I don't want to go down that because I know this is getting more DFA
Okay.
than National Security Council. So now let's transition to domestic issues.
Yes.
Now, first of all, in between President Marcos Jr.'s visit to Australia, he had two visits. He went first,
Yeah.
he gave a speech there, historic.
Parliament.
Came back, then went back again for the Australia-ASEAN Summit. He visited Bangsamoro, and there was a little bit of drama there in the sense of the president, I think, burning some of the guns. So can you just overall, I know it's a complex issue, there are many layers to that, but nasaan tayo ngayon? Where are we today when it comes to the whole reintegration, the mobilization, Bangsamoro transition, of course with elections coming here, elections coming there? What is a snapshot at least, and what is the hope down the road on
Well,
the Bangsamoro front?
We're at the normalization phase, and I have the figures here. It's a lot of the former combatants or former members of the MILF have already joined the normalization stage and have surrendered.
Many
the-
integrated into our
Yes.
security institutions. Yeah.
No, some of them did not, but some of them have already surrendered the MILF issued weapons. Okay, so things are moving in that area, and we're really looking forward to the first parliamentary elections in 2025.
Right.
Because as everybody knows, the past two election cycles were appointees of the president. No, some appointed by Duterte and some were reappointed under Marcos. So we have a functioning parliament, but they're mostly appointees.
Right.
What is critical in the transition of Bangsamoro to a fully functioning instrument of government or government level, because it's a subnational level of the Philippines, no? Our first subnational level in the unitary system in the Philippines is to transition to a fully elected regional parliament, which then will prove to the world that this so-called experiment in the South has actually borne fruit, as it is bearing fruit right now.
And what is the hope really down the road for Bangsamoro to be a vibrant state entity? I mean, what are we looking at here? Uh,
Yeah.
a prosperous region.
Yes. There's so much potential in the
Exactly. Yeah.
Bangsamoro region. There's so much untapped natural resources which could not be developed because of lack of technology and because of the peace and order situation. So, with the Bangsamoro government uh, passing its own 100 billion peso budget, in addition to the block grant coming from the national government. So we're looking at um, enough resources for them to fully develop the region. And with in the improved peace and security situation in the area, the the hope is that
Yeah.
it transitions fully, as it is it transitioning now into a vibrant and you know
What are the lessons we learned from the ARMM experience? I mean, like
that's a
some of
long
the capacity building.
that's a long discussion.
Yeah, yeah, and also, you know, I mean, and also, are we still worried about return of some of these extremist groups? I mean, uh, BIFF, Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, some of the Maute remnants, Daesh, ISIS affiliated groups. Are there some concerns over the horizon on that
Yes,
front? Because it's
our
very quiet. I mean,
Yes,
so
it is.
far,
It
yeah.
is. Our major concern, well, it's not a major concern, but we have to be very vigilant.
Yeah.
But the Mautes are completely decimated. Their fighters have been decimated, and their support system has slowly been dismantled by government. We have issued, the Anti-Terrorism Council have issued notices, and warrants of arrest has been issued to the individuals that were instrumental in providing funds. Okay, so we're looking at the funding source, terrorism financing, to make sure that it doesn't work again. And but we're looking mostly at not Daesh anymore. We're looking at the Maya Islamia. That's the group that
A
has
new
some
splinter group
remnants.
na naman, yeah.
The splinter groups. But as you can see, their capacity to wage terroristic actions has been annihilated or has been lessened. So, insofar as security is concerned, we're very positive about the peace and order security situation.
And is this like an upshot of decades of robust counterterrorism training? Not to mention, of course, the very tough situation in Marawi. I mean,
Yes,
no
yes.
Southeast Asian countries has had that experience of months-long urban warfare counterterrorism activities, right?
Yes, we have a preventing and countering violent extremism program in the BARM, which we implement through our Anti-Terrorism Council Secretariat in cooperation with the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime and the Anti-Terrorism Office of the United Nations. So we've been focusing on PCV activities to ensure that none of this, the radicalization efforts are minimized. No? But, Mindanao is Mindanao. So the government has to be constantly vigilant
Yeah.
to ensure that, all of the gains that we have done will continue to flourish in the future.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm asking is because, of course, you serve in a similar capacity at DLG
Yes.
back in the year when we had, I would say, very successful transition. I mean, I think one of the finest legacies of the previous administration was the peaceful referendum in Bangsamoro. I was in Marawi,
Yes.
also back in 2019 and all, and from my understanding, there was a certain kind of calm that was surprising to a lot of people, and everyone was fearing, is this a calm before the storm? And the storm so far hasn't
Didn't
come,
happen,
right?
yeah.
So that tells
Yeah.
you that something significant has changed on the ground in terms of our capacity, in terms of creating basic security. But when it comes to counterinsurgency, of course, the Philippines hasn't had just the Moro insurgency; it's also the communist insurgency.
Yes.
What is the picture there?
Well, the picture is also good for the first quarter of this year, because our estimates at the end of the year was that they're at around 1,400 or 1,300 armed combatants in the New People's Army. In the first quarter of the year, we have had we have secured and made insurgency-free several provinces, the last of which is Surigao del Norte. Would you believe? For so long, when you talk about Surigao del Norte,
Yeah.
it's just like talking about Northern Samar or Eastern Samar. So they have been declared insurgency-free. So our problem now in that area is just Surigao del Sur. So we have seen some 400 NPA rebels wiped out or surrendered. So total NPA strength is around 1,000 or less. So we're looking at dismantling all of the remaining 11 weakened guerrilla fronts of the New People's Army. There's 3 in Mindanao, 3 in the Visayas, and the rest in Luzon. Uh, the Armed Forces has given a target for all these weakened guerrilla fronts to be totally dismantled.
By the end of the term
By
of
the
this.
end of no, by the end of the year.
Oh, the year,
The year.
2024.
Yes.
Oh.
Very optimistic.
Very ambitious, I would say. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I had a serious discussion with the armed forces about that, and they say when we talk about dismantling a guerrilla front, we're not talking about arresting everyone. We're talking about dismantling the
Capacity,
the organization, because the organization is important, and the support base, because every guerrilla front, if we go back to our Maoist philosophy or doctrines, can only operate if there's mass base.
Right.
And once the mass base is removed, then the organization, the NPA organization or the guerrilla front, like withers in the vine. So that's the target, and it's possible, it's probable. I think the targets have been given to all of the battalions and the brigades, and slowly we're getting there because, as I said, 400 NPA rebels from the total have already been wiped out. So I think we're on target. Now, does that mean next year that there won't be attacks, at least low-level attacks? Not necessarily. There may be, because they may just put their arms somewhere and then go back to them when things get better. That is why, notwithstanding the success of government, we're still looking at the political settlement.
Right.
I think we will render the NPA ineffective if a political settlement is signed. But even if no political settlement is done, we're very optimistic that all guerrilla fronts will be dismantled before the end of the year.
So you're essentially saying that while in theory you have to have both the political and military fronts operating, you're still not pinning all your hopes on the political front, because our experiences, because experiences have not been very encouraging over the past decade, at least, right?
Yes.
Because one of the big concerns was that the people you talk to in Europe, perhaps for peace negotiations, may not necessarily have control over regional commanders back in the Philippines. So that big disconnect and gap creates problems in terms of enforcing any peace deal, right?
Yes. When the negotiating team or the team coming from the government went to Oslo to talk to Mrs. Sison and Halandoni, these are old guys already. They're at the last quarter of their lives, so they see that there's really no hope for them. At this moment when modernization is happening, at this moment when the Philippines is transitioning to territorial defense, they understand that the capacities of the armed forces are beyond what they can defeat. They're one of the last, if not the last, communist insurgency in the world. So they want a political settlement because they are pushed to the corner. Of course, the rhetoric coming from the CPP and NPA is different.
Defiant.
But, yes, but the reality is there. So I think there may be, not sure, but there may be some sincerity on the part of the political entities or the political arm, the NDF. Our hope is that the Central Committee of the CPP actually believes in that political settlement, because that could be a game changer in how we also transition to territorial defense for the country.
Thank you for that. I mean, I want to also transition to non-traditional security and some new emergent security concerns. But before going there, the thing is, we had the United Nations Special Rapporteur in town not long ago, and they were pushing for essentially dismantling of some of the government's agencies, NTF-ELCAC among others. I mean, obviously their concern was coming from the human rights front or alleged abuses that happened either in the past or right now, which of course I know you're going to respond to. But also, I mean, if this thing is already on its last rose, I mean, what's the point of keeping some of these institutions? I mean, this task force and all, if these guys are almost defeated?
Well, I myself was very surprised about that press conference that Irene Khan called at the end of her visit to the Philippines, because she was here for like 10 days. I met with her at the beginning of her stay. I met with her again. I met her like 3 times.
Okay.
And we really, took the time to explain to her that the Philippines is one of the most affected by terrorism, one of the countries most affected by terrorism. So it is important for the Philippines to be rigorous and robust about our terrorism response. And we are now reaping the benefits of our anti-insurgency efforts and the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act. And we explained that to her. No? We gave her books, we gave her presentations, but it was such a big disappointment when at the end of the day, she has apparently made up her mind even before coming to the Philippines. It was, I think, an exercise in futility because she is obviously biased against us. No? But, as you said, now that the insurgency is waning down, maybe it's time for us to revisit the NTF-ELCAC. We completely agree. That's why we even told her that once all of the guerrilla fronts have been dismantled, we can transition into a national task force for unity, peace, and development. We told her that.
Right.
No? And when you transition to that, that means it is no longer military or police operations will be the focus.
It's more social development.
Social development, provision of social services, insulating the conflict areas from terrorism, and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But again, when she made her press statement before she left, there was no mention of the offer of government for the transition to the end. She then made this impassioned appeal for the dismantling of the NTF-ELCAC, primarily because of red tagging. That was the major issue that she mentioned.
But there is a reputational problem, right? Not under this administration, but
Yes.
I think many would argue with some more than basis that there were problems, especially with some people who were before in the task force.
Yes,
who are no
and
longer
I
there.
wouldn't want to sugarcoat that, Richard. No, but what I can say is under this administration,
Right.
it is not the policy of government to red tag, and you don't see government officials, unlike in the past,
Right.
making statements about this or that. We clearly have turned the leaf on that policy. The NTF-ELCAC of the previous administration, while it is the same name, has a different policy insofar as red tagging is concerned. And we made that clear to Irene Khan, but Irene Khan refuses to hear us out.
The reason I'm saying this is that we have a president who consciously has talked about the need for rebranding, essentially,
Yes.
reintroducing the Philippines. And I think President Marcos Jr. correctly emphasized during his visit to Europe recently that his focus when it comes to drug war is on rehabilitation, public health approach, which is
Yes.
music to the ears of human rights community and our democratic partners. And that's exactly, I think, where I'm coming from, which is I think there's a brand problem, at the very least, if not more substantive issues, which has been raised by some groups.
Richard, we wanted to change the name. We wanted at the beginning of the administration.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Because we also realized that the NTF-ELCAC has a reputation problem. It has suffered some reputational damage because of the policies in the previous administration. But when we had this deliberate brainstorming on it, we realized that if we change the name now, it sends a message to the communist insurgents that they don't want a task force anymore to end the communist armed conflict. It's not the right time to do so. There has to be a significant event rather than a change in administration to transition to a new task force, because NTF-ELCAC, for all its faults, has been very effective. If not for the National Task Force ELCAC, we would not be where we are today. We would not have 11 weakened guerrilla fronts. We would not have 80% of all guerrilla fronts suppressed. Why? Because under NTF-ELCAC, we had a whole-of-government, whole-of-nation approach. Before, communist insurgency was just a military or police problem. So it would be a disservice to all of the government agencies that comprise the NTF-ELCAC if we transition just because a new administration came in. The decision was, let's keep the name, but once we have decimated all of the guerrilla fronts, then we go to a new name and a new brand and a new everything to appease this
So you're saying
calls,
that the bathwater was taken care of, right? That do not attack the baby in this sense, which is the value of this agency, and you feel there has not been enough recognition of some of the reforms internal you did, not only in terms of personnel but also in terms of approach.
Yes.
Yeah.
If not for the NTF-ELCAC, we would not see an end to the communist conflict. I can say that, Richard, with enough confidence because I've been with the NTF-ELCAC since it was founded in 2018.
2018. Yeah, I was wondering,
Sorry.
is there another organization I'm not aware of?
I was there, and I was also I also studied and realized that our approach in the past was wrong. NTF-ELCAC brought everyone together. That is why we finally see the end at the light at the end of the tunnel.
Can you a little bit tell me more about the next step, the more social? Because I mean, at the end of the day, the reason why you have insurgency is because there are grievances,
Yes.
there are problems. There are
Yes.
huge, I mean, we see much of the insurgency is happening in the poorest and most underdeveloped regions of the country.
Yes.
Clearly, it's more than just a coincidence, right?
Yes.
That it's even more than a correlation, I would say. So, is there a kind of a systematic approach, do you think?
Yes, yes, there is
Or
a
how do you make
systematic
sure
approach.
there's a systematic approach?
Well, we have a database, of course, of all of the barangays that are conflict affected, who are formerly NPA bastions or NPA influence that have been cleared already by government forces. So we are focusing development projects on them through the Barangay Development Program. Once a barangay is cleared, the DILG comes in through the Retooled Community Support Program, which is essentially an engagement mechanism to the barangay. We ask the barangay, what are the projects you
Right.
need? What kind of assistance do you need from government? Because admittedly, these are neglected parts of the country because they are poor, disadvantaged, and far away from major urban populations.
Right.
So the strategy is to bring government services, bring it closer to government, so that's to insulate them from further NPA influence. And this has been very successful. So the role really of the new task force, once we transition it to the new task force, is now will be socio-economic development, focusing government intervention in those areas to insulate them from communist influence.
You said before I transition the last part of this episode to talk about non-traditional security and new emergent security concerns. I want to go back to this because one of the concerns that has also been raised is the weaponization of the whole counterinsurgency environment by some militia groups, by some, nefarious elements. Let's say people who want to grab land, and what they do is
Okay.
they'll point at an indigenous community and say, "Oh, mga ano yan, mga kasama yan." They're the base of certain. And so I've seen a lot of reports. I mean, again, I want to also get your part, which is, this was weaponized, right? This whole of nation approach was like some people took it upon themselves to essentially do vigilante killings or something along those lines against groups that they will just, so it's not just red tag of government official against alleged government officials against people. It's also some paramilitary groups, some interested groups, some, I don't know, mining company or corporation doing something nasty here and there. Are there efforts by the government to make sure that this is not getting abused by other elements, nefarious
Well,
elements?
I'd like to hear about those reports, where they are, because I can assure you we'll act on them. The problem with indigenous groups is that they've been also used by the other side. If you look at the demographics of the New People's Army and the Militia ng Bayan, around 80% of them come from indigenous groups. No, the indigenous, they are the ones who are radicalized because they live in the mountains and they have very little or poor education. Therefore, it's very easy for them to be influenced by communist ideology. So.
And they're unfortunately vulnerable also to predation by
Yes.
non-communist elements.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's why I'd
exactly.
like to hear from you what areas
Right.
are those, if you can give me those information so that we can act on them, because that's not a policy of government for us to further marginalize or
Yeah.
abuse or put strain on these people, the indigenous peoples who just happen to be in those conflict affected areas.
The key issues that is emerging nowadays is cybersecurity.
Yes.
It's huge, and the Philippines.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah, the Philippines is trying to develop its, technological capabilities, training accordingly. Last year, when President Marcos Jr. was
Yes.
in the Pentagon, that was one of the issues that came out in our revised guideline, Mutual Defense Treaty Guidelines discussion. Where are we there? Because honestly, if you look at threats to the Philippines, whether non-state actor or state actors,
Yeah.
the level of sophistication of cyber attacks and concerns with
Yeah.
vulnerability for our critical infrastructure is increasing by the day.
That's right,
Where are we there? What's the state of play?
Well, it's an emerging threat. It's something that we're trying to get our hands on because now that because of tensions in the West Philippine Sea
Yeah.
and because of cybersecurity threats coming from outside the country, we now realize that we have to fortify our cybersecurity. There are recommendations for a cybersecurity command
Right.
in the Armed Forces of the Philippines.
Cyber
So
command,
This is
yeah, yeah.
something tangible. which I think is critical for us because there's not just foreign malign influence. There's just not foreign interference, but there's also cyber attacks,
Yeah, sabotage, total.
critical infrastructure. So that's one. The president just issued an executive order adding a new unit in the National Intelligence Coordinating Agency, focused on cybersecurity. So we also in the NSC have a team in place working with other nations because that's one of the cooperation agreements we have with many countries, the U.S. in particular,
Right.
and many other countries. They want to share with us their experiences because they are much advanced
Yes.
in terms of cyber. Ours are, we're just beginning to understand the gravity of the problem because when we talk about cyber before, we were just looking at individuals' privacy,
Right.
attacks on banks, and stuff like that. But now we understand that our critical infrastructure are also vulnerable, and in case things go haywire, we need to be able to defend ourselves in the cyber domain.
I don't want to push you too much on this, but do you think that we may also move in a direction whereby we may revisit certain investments by certain companies and countries in our critical infrastructure, whether it's grid, whether it's telecommunications? Is the government reviewing the current state of vulnerability? Yeah.
Yes, the NGCP is a important component of our electric systems in the Philippines. We understand our vulnerability
Right.
there. That's why the NICA is there, looking at the vulnerability of our systems. We're also reviewing some certain investments in some strategic industries. We now realize that our critical infrastructure has to be defended, and we have to insulate them from cyber attacks. So that is something that we are now seriously taking care of. Yeah.
And you say, obviously, I think there's going to be a public-private kind of coordination here too, right? As our economy becomes more digital, right? So it's not just capabilities of nefarious actors improving, but it's also our economy is becoming much more sophisticated.
Yes.
Much of our activities is now done online. Digital economy, digital pay, who knows with cryptocurrencies where they're going. Is the government really preparing for a much more sophisticated, digitally driven economy and all the vulnerabilities that come with it?
Yes, I think we've reached a point of no return. The pandemic has opened up the online systems,
Right.
the digitalization of government. More and more government agencies are transferring their services online. We can now apply for a lot of stuff online, and that creates vulnerabilities as well.
Sure.
And sometimes you hear stories of, this was prone to cyber attack because the antivirus software was not updated. Sometimes it takes a paradigm shift also in terms of government agencies investing in a dedicated IT department.
Digital hygiene, I think that's the term. Digital hygiene, right? It's a maintenance thing. Yeah.
Because sometimes, Richard, you still see government agencies that have an EDP as their IT department. And you all know what an EDP is, right?
Old school.
Very old school, so they have not transitioned yet. So now the DICT is leading the way in changing the mindsets because, sometimes government takes a long time to change mindsets. So I think what's critical is to change the mindset and provide government agencies
and the training
the
and
revenues and the
familiarization.
training and the familiarization to get things done.
That also brings us to vulnerability in terms of our election infrastructure, right? That was big concern in Taiwan. That is obviously big concern in the United States. Are we also looking at that angle of our election integrity?
That's a very good question, Richard, because I just raised that in a meeting last week.
Right.
We have not yet really studied foreign interference in our democratic systems, at least in our elections.
Yeah, it's big.
It is big, and I don't know, and I don't think the COMELEC is preparing for that.
Right.
I raised this already to them. We should make studies, we should make preparations, because I think 2025, as a prelude to 2028, is critical. And if what our partners, allies, and friends are telling us, this is a standard across the world. Foreign interference in elections are becoming more and more prevalent.
Yeah.
And given that the Philippines is at the forefront of tensions in this part of the world, we should prepare for possible foreign interference in our elections.
I mean, exactly. I mean, that's why I don't see the 2025 just as a prelude. 2025 could become a kind of a proxy, right, by certain nefarious actors, to try to influence the direction. I'm
Yes.
sure some have made it clear that they're not happy with how you guys have been protecting the Philippine sovereign rights, and it's not like we have no people trying to, sing to the tune of some other countries, right, rather than our
Yes.
own national interest, right?
Yeah. I mentioned it as a prelude because the real cake is the 2028 elections.
Presidency, yeah.
Because the presidency will mean a shift in foreign policy. But 2025 is also critical because you're talking about a change in the composition of the Senate, at least half of it, and of course, re-elections in the entire House of Representatives. Right. So it is an important event that we must prepare for. And I don't see any government agency preparing for foreign interference.
Which is just shocking. I mean, the reason, again, I raised this, I just thought about raising it as we were discussing things is, I remember a few years ago, I talked back then with the spokesman of COMELEC, and because even 5-6 years ago, I was still concerned about interference. I was based in Taiwan. I was, based in different countries. Australia back in the day, where there was a lot of discussion about this. And the admission that we don't even have any mechanisms to monitor foreign financing, and also it was just mind-boggling to me, because like, how do we make sure our candidates who end up there are not getting money and resources, if not policy inputs, right?
That's right.
From the wrong side. And by any foreign power should not be the case, right? After all, this is about the sovereignty of our nation. So I hope there will be more recognition. And are allies also kind of also worried about us? Like, hey, you guys maybe want to do a little bit of a fence making there, right?
Yes, they did raise it to us, and that's why it came to our attention that this is an aspect of preparedness that we have not really considered. Yeah. And given that the elections are forthcoming, we at the NSC will raise the alarm and make sure that discussions
and DITC, I suppose, and some of the
DICT has to take the lead here. COMELEC has to work very closely with us, make sure that our systems in COMELEC are protected, but also the aspect of foreign malign influence to sow disinformation, sow misinformation, disinformation, fake news. The same thing that has happened in the United States could clearly happen in the
Taiwan,
Philippines.
for that matter.
Or Taiwan, for that
using
matter.
our freedoms against ourselves.
Yes.
Weaponizing our own freedoms and openness. And I think something that people really have to appreciate.
Taking advantage of domestic issues or gaps in domestic tensions.
Right. Fault lines.
To weaken the Philippine resolve and pressure the Philippines to take a policy that is not in our interest.
Right. And last point, and I don't think we can end any policy issue without focusing on this, climate change. I think I've run out of how many indices I've seen where the Philippines is top 5 in the world, if not worse, top 3 in terms of vulnerability to the negative effects of climate change. And it could spiral from there, right? Extremist groups could take advantage of a devastated community. Climate change could hurt some of our critical infrastructure. What is the Philippine government doing on its own and in cooperation with LGUs, in cooperation with international partners, to make us a much more, I hate using the word resilient, more, capable and robust, as climate change becomes a much more serious issue? I mean, it's happening. We can see that this year has been hotter than ever as far as the records are concerned. The sakura in Japan came 1 week earlier. I mean, as like early mid-March pa lang, I could see the sakura in some parts of Japan. It was like shocking. It's a bit too early. So clearly in the Philippines, the vulnerabilities will be there, right?
Climate change requires a whole-of-nation, whole-of-government approach. We in the National Security Council, we recognize it as a problem. That is why if you look at the national security policy, climate change is a security threat. It is a national security threat. So the NSP produces what is called as the NSS, or the National Security Strategy. We're almost done. We have several drafts already. We already talked with several government agencies to get the NSS done. There is a section on climate change. So we do recognize that climate change is a national security threat. But at the end of the day, we are not. We are, in terms of let's talk about carbon emissions, for example. CO2 emissions, which is causing climate change. One of the major causes of climate change. Our contribution is less than 1%.
I know.
It's really
Which is less than our GDP share of the global. So we're below our.
we're below.
Yeah. Average. Yeah.
I think what we're not doing right, because in terms of CO2 emissions, we're doing right in transitioning to power plants, renewable energies like hydro and air and all of wind and all of that. No, but I think what we need more work is on pollution, because if you look at plastics,
Number one yata tayo, or two? Like we're competing with Indonesia and China,
yes,
right?
we are. Yes, we are. In the
really
Asia
bad.
Pacific, we're top 3.
Yeah.
We're producing plastics that are polluting the oceans and are being eaten by fish, and it comes out as a microplastic.
And it comes back to us. Yeah.
And it comes back to us because it can be one of the causes of cancer.
Yeah.
These microplastics,
Toxics, yeah.
toxic. So, insofar as that's concerned, we have to do more on that. So, as I said, but in terms of climate change in general, we have been doing well. We have transitioned very well in the use of renewables, and there are more renewable energy projects that are ongoing. But on other aspects, we need to do more. That is why we're working closely with the Climate Change Commission and the other government agencies to make climate change, resilience, and adaptation a very important aspect of our national security policy and the national security strategy.
Thank you so much. That was a tour de force. I know. I was like, thank you so much, Usec, for joining us. That was really a lot, but ginusto mo yan eh. You're working in the National Security Council. We're a country in the midst of so many problems, so I just felt it's very important we cover all the key bases.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Richard, I have such much respect for you because you bring a lot to the conversation, and you've been doing a lot also in portraying our country as a middle power.
Yes.
So
I'm glad
that aspect.
I'm glad that you guys are absorbing what's slowly happening. Yeah, I think ang kinina natin. But of course, with middle power comes a little bit more responsibility.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Usec.
Thank you.
Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Heydarian, and this was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.